Hey everyone, welcome back to another chilling episode. I've got something truly unsettling to share with you today, something that happened to me not too long ago. This isn't just another ghost story or urban legend. This one is real. It happened to me, and I still can't shake the feeling that there's something out there watching me. It all started with a weekend getaway to a mountain resort. I thought it would be a perfect break a chance to escape the grind and relax in the serenity of the mountains. The resort was a bit isolated, tucked away far from any bustling towns, which made it feel even more alluring. Perfect for a retreat, right? I remember pulling up to the resort on a cold Friday evening. The sun was setting behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows over the cabin-lined pathways. The place looked picturesque, like something straight out of a brochure. Everything seemed so perfect, but we all know what they say about perfection, don't we? The resort was pretty much empty when I arrived, except for a few guests who appeared to be lost in their own world. The staff seemed friendly, a little too friendly, but I didn't think much of it at the time. They gave me a key to a cabin that was tucked away toward the back of the property, the kind of place you'd think no one would ever find you. It was all so quiet, too quiet. The only sounds I could hear were the crunch of my boots on the gravel path. There was something haunting about that silence. But I told myself that it was just the remoteness of the place. It's what people want when they come up to the mountains, right? Peace, solitude. I didn't know yet, but this was where my nightmare was about to begin. When I got to the cabin, everything seemed, well, just as you'd expect. Wooden walls, an old stone fireplace, a queen-sized bed with crisp white sheets. The air was cool but not uncomfortable, and there was a smell of pine and earth that filled the room. I dropped my bags and immediately opened the window to let in the fresh air. I needed that mountain breeze to clear my head, but as soon as I opened it, I felt a shift in the air, like the temperature dropped by a few degrees, or maybe it was just my nerves starting to creep in. I ignored it, of course, because who wouldn't? I was there to enjoy myself. The first night went by quietly. No strange noises, no strange sensations, just the usual sounds of the mountain wilderness. Owls, crickets, and the wind whispering through the trees. I turned in early, hoping to wake up refreshed and ready for the hikes I had planned the next day. But I didn't sleep. I don't know what woke me up. Maybe it was the creaking of the floorboards, or the sudden chill that washed over me. But I remember sitting up in bed, heart racing, staring into the darkness. The air had become so cold, so thick, like something was pressing in on the cabin. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. I didn't think much of it at first, just assumed I'd forgotten to charge it. But then, I heard it. A soft tapping. It came from the window. I froze. My blood ran cold, and for a moment, I thought it might be some animal, like a bird or a squirrel, tapping at the glass. But the tapping grew louder, more deliberate. Tap, 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 like someone was trying to get my attention. My mind raced through the possibilities. Was it a prank? A trick? Or was something else out there? I told myself to relax. I told myself to ignore it. But then, I heard it again, this time louder, more insistent. The tapping came from both windows, the ones on the left and the right side of the cabin. I didn't know how that was possible. There was no one out there. I was sure of it. And then I heard a voice. Let me in. A whisper. Barely audible at first, but it was there. A cold, hollow voice that seemed to seep through the walls, crawling into my mind. My body went rigid. I wanted to scream, but my throat closed up, as if some invisible force was choking me. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the window, but there was nothing, just the blackness of the night, stretching out beyond a small pool of light. But I could feel it. Something was out there. Something was watching me, waiting. I pressed my back into the bed, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't control. It was just the wind. It had to be. I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself down, but the tapping didn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. It was getting louder, and that voice was getting closer. Let me in. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of bed, rushing to the window to close it. But as I pulled the curtain back, my breath caught in my throat. There, standing just outside the glass, was a figure. A figure of a person, standing motionless, staring into the cabin with dark, hollow eyes. Its features were obscured by shadow, but there was no mistaking the twisted, unnatural shape of its body. It was too tall, too thin, and as it stared at me, I felt a coldness settle deep within my bones, something that went beyond the temperature of the night air. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My body refused to obey, like I was paralyzed with fear. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. And then, as if it knew I was looking at it, it grinned. That smile, the twisted, grotesque curl of its lips, and a shock through me. It wasn't a human smile. It was something else, something dark, something that didn't belong in this world. The figure began to slowly raise its hand, pressing it against the glass of the window. I could see the long, thin fingers stretching toward me. The glass felt like it was vibrating beneath the pressure, and the air around me became so thick, so heavy, that it was hard to breathe. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The tapping stopped. The coldness lifted. And just like that, the cabin was silent again. But I knew something had changed. I had no idea who or what that figure was, but I couldn't stay there anymore. Not alone, not with that thing out there. The next morning, I left the cabin. But things were about to get worse. I left the cabin early the next morning, my heart still racing from what had happened the night before. The sun had barely risen, but the quiet morning light was a welcomed contrast to the terror of the night. I convinced myself that it had all been a bad dream, that maybe I had imagined the figure at the window. But deep down, I knew better. I could still feel its presence, like a dark shadow hovering just out of sight. I walked quickly to the main lodge, trying to push the unsettling images from my mind. The place seemed even more desolate in the daylight. The resort was practically empty. A few cars were parked along the main lot, but there were no signs of life. No voices, no laughter, just the eerie stillness that seemed to hang in the air. I stepped inside the lodge and approached the front desk, where an older man greeted me with a forced smile. His eyes were tired, his skin pale, and he gave me an unsettling feeling I couldn't shake. I thought it might be because of what I had experienced, but his eyes, those eyes, seemed to hold something darker, like he knew more than he was letting on. "Good morning," he said, though his voice lacked warmth. "How can I help you?" I hesitated. I didn't know how to even start explaining what had happened the night before. I just wanted to ask if there's anything strange about the cabins here? Like paranormal activity, or..." The man's expression changed instantly. His face went pale, and he leaned in closer, lowering his voice as though he didn't want anyone else to hear. "Listen, young lady, there are things out here, things that you don't want to know about." My stomach dropped. The hair on the back of my neck stood up as I leaned in, trying to catch every word. "What do you mean? What's going on here?" He glanced around nervously, making sure no one was listening. "I shouldn't be telling you this, but," he sighed, looking defeated, "it happens every few years. They come for a quiet retreat, just like you, and then they're gone, vanished. Sometimes they return, sometimes they don't." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, return?" The man shifted uncomfortably, but he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Some people come back, but they're not the same. They don't remember anything. They don't speak. They just wander the resort, staring at nothing. And then they vanish again." I opened my mouth to ask more, but he cut me off. "Look, I don't know who's behind it. No one talks about it. People who've worked here long enough have seen it, but no one dares ask questions. You don't want to know more. Believe me, it's better that way." The words hung in the air, suffocating me. I felt like I was trapped in some twisted version of a dream, unable to wake up. I wasn't sure what to do with the information he had just dropped on me, but I knew one thing. I had to leave. I couldn't stay another night in that cabin, not after everything that had happened. I thanked the man, though my voice sounded distant, as if I was already drifting into a state of panic. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a figure standing at the window, just behind the glass. My blood went cold as I turned my head, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. Was I seeing things? I made my way to the resort's small cafe, hoping to gather my thoughts and figure out what to do next. I needed to get in touch with someone, anyone who could help me. As I sipped on a lukewarm cup of coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was as if invisible eyes were watching me from every corner. A few minutes later, a woman walked in. She was tall, with dark hair that cascaded down her back in thick waves. She looked out of place here, almost like she didn't belong. Her eyes were wide with a sort of frantic energy, and she seemed to be scanning the room in a nervous, hurried way. When her eyes locked with mine, I froze. She walked straight toward me, her footsteps heavy, like she was desperate to speak to me. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Did you stay in one of the cabins?" I nodded slowly, unsure where this conversation was headed. "Yeah, I stayed in cabin 7, actually. Why?" Her face paled even further, and she lowered her voice. You're lucky you're still here." Confused and a bit alarmed, I asked, "What do you mean?" The woman glanced around, making sure no one was within earshot. "I've been coming to this resort for years. I used to think it was just bad luck, but there's something wrong here. The cabins, they're haunted, you know? But it's not just ghosts, it's something else, something older, something that lives in the mountains." She took a shaky breath, her eyes wild. "A few years ago, my husband and I stayed here. We were in cabin 5, right next to yours. That night, I heard noises. Scratching, tapping at the window, just like you. I thought it was an animal, but when I went to check, I saw something standing outside. Tall, thin, like it didn't belong. I felt my heart race. It was like she was describing exactly what I had seen the night before. "What happened?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Her face twisted in agony as she clutched her hands together. The next morning, my husband was gone, just vanished. There was no sign of him. His clothes, his phone, everything was left behind. And when I asked the staff about it, they acted like I was crazy. No one would help me. But then, a week later, I saw him again. He was standing outside my cabin, just like that thing, tall, thin, grinning at me. But his eyes, they were empty. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. I could feel my breath catch in my throat as I listened to her story. This was exactly like what I had experienced, but somehow worse. And what made it worse was that I could see the terror in her eyes. She wasn't lying. Whatever was happening here was real. The woman leaned closer, her voice now frantic. "I don't know who you are, but if you're smart, you'll leave. Don't come back. Don't ever come back." She turned and rushed out of the cafe, leaving me sitting there with a million thoughts racing through my mind. Was she telling the truth? Was there something about these mountains that I hadn't yet uncovered? And then, as I sat there, I saw it. A figure standing outside the window, just like the woman described. Tall, thin, with eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. It was smiling. I couldn't shake the image of the figure smiling at me through the window. I had to leave. I couldn't stay another minute in that place, but something inside me, something dark, something instinctive kept me from running. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was something else, but I stayed in the cafe for a while longer, frozen to the spot, my eyes darting around the room, looking for any sign of movement. The figure outside was gone, but the dread still hung in the air, like a suffocating blanket. I tried to focus on my coffee, but the taste had turned bitter in my mouth. I wanted to ask the staff about the woman I had just spoken to, but they were all busy, too distracted by something I couldn't quite place. The atmosphere in the lodge felt off. It felt like something was wrong, but no one was saying anything. A few minutes later, I stood up to leave, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to get out of the lodge. I needed to get away from whatever it was that had already taken hold of me. As I stepped outside, I saw the man from the front desk, the one who had warned me about the disappearances. His eyes met mine, and for a moment he looked almost relieved, like he knew I was leaving, like he had been waiting for me to do just that. "You should go," he said, his voice low. "It's not safe here anymore." I wasn't sure if he meant the resort, or if he meant me, but the weight of his words hung over me like a heavy cloud. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak, and turned to leave the lodge behind. I didn't even make it halfway down the gravel path before I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps following behind me. At first, I thought it might be the man, or perhaps someone else, but when I turned, there was no one there, just the empty path stretching out in front of me. But then, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I whipped around, heart in my throat, and saw nothing. But the feeling, it was undeniable. Someone or something was close. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as I quickened my pace, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I glanced over my shoulder one last time before ducking into the nearby trees to try and cut through to the main road. I wasn't sure where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. As I pushed through the thick underbrush, something caught my eye, a faint light, flickering in the distance. It was coming from one of the cabins, the same one I had stayed in. I felt a sudden urge to go back, to confront whatever was happening there, but fear held me back. Instead, I moved closer, keeping to the shadows as I crept toward the glowing light. When I got closer, I noticed something odd. The cabin looked completely different now. The windows were dark, too dark, as if they were coated in something thick, something that shouldn't be there. The door was ajar, and the air around it was thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness. I stepped forward cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I heard it again. The soft whisper coming from inside the cabin. "Let me in." It was the same voice. Cold, hollow, unhuman. I couldn't stop myself. I had to know what was inside. I had to know what had been watching me. I pushed the door open slowly, the creaking sound of the hinges loud in the silence. The moment I stepped inside, the temperature dropped dramatically. I could see my breath in front of me, swirling in the dim light. The cabin was completely still, eerily so. Everything appeared to be exactly how I had left it, except for one thing: the back wall. A large section of it had been torn away, exposing a hidden room behind it. The dark doorway loomed, pulling me in like some unseen force. Without thinking, I stepped toward the opening. I didn't hear the footsteps at first, but then, the soft thud of someone moving closer, sent a shockwave of panic through me. I turned around, heart racing, and found myself face to face with a person. At least, I thought it was a person. The figure was shrouded in a black cloak, its face obscured by a dark hood. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel them on me. I could feel the weight of its gaze, and it was suffocating. "Are you lost?" the figure asked, its voice low and gravelly, as if it had not spoken in years. My legs felt like they were made of stone. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. "I've been waiting for you," it said, its voice almost a whisper. "You shouldn't have come back." Before I could react, the figure reached out, its long fingers brushing my arm. The coldness of its touch made my skin crawl, sending a wave of ice through my veins. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. In that moment, everything around me seemed to blur. The cabin, the figure, the wall sit all began to warp and distort. And then, as if by some unseen hand, the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me in the dark. I tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. I screamed, but my voice was drowned out by the silence that filled the room. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. I wasn't alone anymore. I could feel the presence of other hundreds of them surrounding me, silent, watching, waiting. I knew with every ounce of my being that the resort wasn't just haunted. It was a prison for the lost, a prison for the ones who had disappeared. And now, I was one of them. The walls seemed to close in around me, as though the entire cabin was alive, breathing with a dark and ancient rhythm. The figure before me was still, its presence almost suffocating. But it wasn't just the figure that terrified me, it was the sense of other eyes in the room. They were watching, invisible to the naked eye, but I could feel them, like an unshakable weight pressing down on me from all sides. I tried to back away, but the room was getting smaller. The air was so thick it felt like I was breathing through a wet cloth. I stumbled, my hands shaking as I reached out for anything, trying to anchor myself in a reality that seemed to be slipping away. And then, the figure spoke again, its voice colder than ever. "You shouldn't have come here. Not like this." The words made no sense to me. I didn't understand why the figure was speaking to me, as though it knew me, as though I had made some sort of mistake by coming here. I wanted to ask what it meant, but the words wouldn't form. I could feel my mind slipping, the darkness creeping in. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it took a step forward. As it did, the shadows around it seemed to grow, crawling along the floor and up the walls, like they were feeding off its presence. And then the whispering started, a faint, soft murmur coming from all around me. The voices were unintelligible at first, but gradually they began to form word swords I could understand. They were calling out to me, begging me to listen. "Help us, please, don't leave us here." I spun around, looking for the source of the voices, but there was nothing but the darkness and the oppressive silence of the cabin. "Who are you? Where are you?" I demanded, my voice shaky but desperate. The figure finally answered, though its words seemed to carry an unbearable weight. "We are the ones who were forgotten. We are the lost." The air grew colder. The whispering grew louder. The figure stepped closer, its cloak swishing as if caught in a phantom breeze. "We were once like you. We came here for peace, for a getaway from the world. But this place, it's not what it seems. It never was. You were meant to stay forever." Suddenly, a cold hand reached out from the shadows, grabbing my wrist with bone-crushing force. The pain shot through me, but it wasn't just physical. It was as if something inside me was being pulled, dragged by the invisible force that held me in place. The figure's face remained hidden, but I could feel its presence growing stronger, more oppressive, until it was almost unbearable. The air in the cabin seemed to shimmer, as though reality itself was warping around me. The shadows on the walls twisted into grotesque shapes, faces, hands, figures that looked like they had once been human, but were now something else entirely. They all stared at me, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. "They are the ones who didn't listen," the figure murmured, its voice barely audible above the chorus of whispers. "They stayed, and now they are trapped here, like us." I felt my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't breathe, my vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was going to pass out from the sheer terror. "I don't want to stay," I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. The figure's cold hand tightened around my wrist. "You don't have a choice. You're already one of us now." I screamed, struggling to break free, but the grip only grew stronger, colder, more unyielding. The shadows in the cabin seemed to come alive, stretching toward me, enveloping me in their darkness. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, until it drowned out everything else. And then, something strange happened. I felt a sharp tug, a sensation that felt like it was pulling me back out of the darkness. The figure's grip on my wrist weakened, just for a moment, and I took my chance. I pulled away, stumbling backward toward the hidden doorway in the back of the cabin. The room spun around me as I ran, my footsteps echoing in the suffocating silence. I didn't know where I was going, but I had to get out. I had to escape the nightmare. As I reached the hidden doorway, I threw myself through it, crashing into the narrow space behind the wall. The room was cramped and dark, but there was something more comforting about the darkness here. Something familiar. I collapsed against the stone walls, gasping for air, my body trembling from the adrenaline. My head was spinning, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was awake or dreaming. But then, I heard something. A soft click, the sound of something heavy shifting. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. In the corner of the room was a large chest covered in dust. It looked old, too old, and yet it was somehow. There was something inside, something that made my gut twist with fear. The whispering started again, this time from within the chest. "Open it, you have to open it." I backed away, my heart racing, but the whispering wouldn't stop. The sound was getting louder, more insistent. I had no choice. I approached the chest, my hands shaking as I slowly lifted the heavy lid. Inside, there was nothing at first, nothing but darkness. But then, I saw it. A pair of eyes, pale, hollow eyes, staring back at me from the depths of the chest. A low growl rumbled from the darkness as the figure in the chest slowly rose, its long, twisted limbs unfolding. It was hunched, almost skeletal, with skin that seemed to melt away with every movement. I stumbled backward, my heart slamming against my ribs. But it was too late. The creature lunged, its cold fingers wrapping around my ankles, dragging me back toward the chest. And as I screamed, I realized the truth. There was no escape, no way out of this nightmare. Once you entered, you were never meant to leave. I was being pulled, dragged back toward the chest, my body fighting desperately against the creature's unyielding grip. My legs were already half in the darkness when I felt something sharp, its claws digging into my skin, pulling me down into that suffocating void. The air grew thick, pressing against me, and I could feel my lungs burning from the lack of oxygen. I screamed, but no sound came out. It was as though the chest itself had swallowed my voice, leaving me in a silent, endless nightmare. I fought with every ounce of strength left in me, but my arms felt heavy. My legs, too. The weight of the creature seemed to grow, suffocating me from all sides. It was only when my fingertips brushed the edge of the stone wall that I realized there was still a chance. In a moment of blind panic, I dug my fingers into the rough surface of the wall behind me, pushing with every ounce of energy I had left. The creature's cold hands tightened, but I pushed harder, kicking against the darkness that threatened to consume me. I don't know how I did it. Maybe it was sheer will, or perhaps I was just lucky, but I managed to break free, stumbling away from the chest, gasping for air. My heart was pounding in my chest, and for a moment, I thought I had escaped until I turned and saw the figure. The same figure that had spoken to me before, the one with the cloak and the hood. It was standing in the doorway now, watching me with those cold, unfeeling eyes. But there was something different about it now, something far worse. Its face was no longer obscured by shadows. I could see it clearly now. The face was wrong, twisted, distorted like a mask of melted skin stretched over a skull. There were no eyes, just empty sockets where they should have been. Its mouth was stretched into a grotesque smile, but there was nothing human about it. It took a step forward, and the entire cabin seemed to tremble with its movement. "You're one of us now," it said, its voice like nails scraping against glass. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to accept it. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had already been claimed. The resort, the lodge, the cabin, they weren't just haunted. They were feeding grounds, feeding on souls. And now, it had claimed me. Before I could turn to run, the walls seemed to shift, the floor beneath me buckling and groaning like it was alive. I could feel the entire building moving, rearranging itself, as if it had become something sentient, something that knew exactly what it wanted. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. The air was thick, heavier than ever before, and my vision began to blur. I felt as though I was sinking into the floor, the very earth beneath me pulling me down. There was no escape. The figure reached out, its skeletal hand grabbing mine. "You'll never leave," it whispered. And in that moment, the horror truly set in. This was no ordinary haunted resort. It was a place where the lost souls of the past lingered, waiting for their next victim to arrive. Once you entered, there was no leaving. It didn't matter how much you fought. It didn't matter how much you screamed. You were never meant to escape. You were part of the resort now. I fell to my knees, overcome by a wave of cold dread. The walls were closing in, and the whispers, those horrible, terrible whispers, were growing louder. In that moment, I understood the true horror of the resort. The bodies of the lost souls, those whose lives had been stolen long ago, weren't just waiting to be freed. They were waiting for more, waiting for new arrivals to take their place. And as I stared into the hollow, empty eyes of the figure that had claimed me, I realized I wasn't the only one. There were others, Hundreds, thousands, souls that had been trapped in this cursed place for centuries. And they were all watching me now, their hollow eyes fixated on me as I became one of them. I could feel the cold spreading through my veins. My chest tightened, and the air became more oppressive with each passing second. I could feel my body changing, my soul slipping away, becoming just another lost spirit, another face in the endless darkness of the mountain. And then everything went black. This is where my story ends. The last piece of the puzzle, the final revelation, has been revealed. The terror that haunted the mountain resort has claimed me, and now it waits for its next victim. I am one of the lost, trapped in the eternal darkness of that cursed place. I hope you never have to experience what I did. But if you ever find yourself in the mountains, in the dead of night, and you see a cabin, a resort, a place that promises remember my story, and remember the truth. There are no escape routes in the place of the lost. Thank you all for listening to this terrifying tale. It's something I'll never forget, and something I hope you'll never have to live. Stay safe out there, and always be cautious about where you choose to stay, because some places, like this one, never let you leave. I hope you enjoyed the full story. Let me know if you have any thoughts or questions. Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight's story is one that I can't shake from my mind, no matter how much time passes. It's not just any ghost story or creepy encounter, it's a story that happened to me, one I've never shared publicly, but now I feel it's time. This tale is about a mountain resort I stayed at a while ago, a place that promised peace and tranquility but ended up being the worst mistake of my life. What I'm about to share with you, I still struggle to understand myself. I've been haunted by what I saw there, and I'm afraid that if I don't talk about it, it'll haunt me forever. It all began with an email I received. The subject line read, "A resort too quiet, a place you should never go." The message was from a woman named Emily, and she claimed to have stayed at the very same mountain resort that I was planning on visiting. She warned me not to go, but she didn't explain why, only that it was a place where people disappeared. At the time, I dismissed it as the ramblings of someone who had maybe had one too many bad experiences with creepy places. I was looking for a getaway, somewhere quiet and remote to escape the chaos of city life. The resort seemed perfect, nestled high in the mountains, surrounded by forests, lakes, and fresh air. The reviews online were glowing, and every picture looked like a slice of paradise. But something about Emily's email gnawed at me. Her words stuck with me. Even as I packed my bags and set off on the drive up to the mountain, I shrugged it off, convincing myself that it was just an overactive imagination, or maybe some personal issue Emily had that wasn't related to the place itself. As I made my way up the winding mountain roads, the sun began to set, casting the landscape in eerie shadows. The trees around me grew thicker, the air cooler and more still with each mile. There was an unsettling quiet to the whole place that felt wrong. When I finally reached the resort, it looked just like the photos I had seen online too. Perfect. The kind of place that made you think nothing could possibly go wrong. The lobby was warm, inviting, and smelled like pine and freshly baked bread. The receptionist, an older woman with a tight smile, checked me in with little conversation. "You're here for the weekend, right?" she asked in a polite, almost rehearsed tone. I nodded, feeling that same unease from Emily's email creep back up my spine. "Enjoy your stay," she said, handing me the key to a small cabin tucked away at the edge of the resort. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." I thanked her, took the key, and made my way outside to the cabin. The closer I got, the more isolated it felt, as though I were stepping further away from civilization, deeper into the mountains. The path was overgrown with tall grass, and the dimming light from the setting sun made everything feel oddly distant, like I was walking in a dream. When I arrived, the cabin looked cozy but worn. The wooden exterior had been weathered by time, and the windows were covered by thick curtains. Inside, the cabin was quiet, and I was struck by how still everything seemed. There was no noise, no breeze through the trees outside, nothing. I tried to shake the feeling that something was off, but it lingered in the back of my mind, heavy and oppressive. As I settled in, I decided to take a walk around the resort to clear my head. The sky above was turning a deep purple, and the air was colder than I had anticipated. I walked past the cabins, noticing how few lights were on in the other rooms. It felt as though no one else was around, though I knew the place was supposed to be full. I came across a small clearing just beyond the cabins, and that's when I saw it. A large, old-fashioned treehouse. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong. The wood was splintered, and vines had grown around it, almost choking the structure. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to climb up and take a look. The ladder was creaky, and the air was colder up there. I reached the top, and my heart nearly stopped. Inside the treehouse was a single small cot, and on the floor beside it, a pile of old, dusty journals. They were yellowed with age, the pages brittle to the touch. I picked one up and skimmed through it, my eyes widening as I read the strange entries. They were filled with disturbing notes about the resort, references to guests who had come and never left, mysterious disappearances, and strange occurrences that no one talked about. The last entry in the journal sent chills down my spine. It was written in frantic, almost illegible handwriting. "They've come for me. I can hear them calling from the woods. I won't be the next one. I won't let them take me too." The page ended abruptly. My heart was pounding as I shut the journal and hurried down the ladder, my mind racing. What was going on here? Why had no one mentioned this strange treehouse? And who had written these journals? When I returned to the main resort area, I was almost too shaken to enjoy the rest of my evening. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably some creepy old history, but the uneasy feeling from earlier still clung to me like a shadow. I tried to shake it off, but that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the journals. I needed answers, and I decided that tomorrow I would confront the staff, ask them about the treehouse, about the missing guests, about the warnings that seemed to lurk beneath the surface of the resort. But as I drifted off to sleep, I heard something soft, but unmistakable, the creaking of the floorboards. Someone or something was walking around outside my cabin. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Could it be one of the other guests? Or was there something else on this mountain? The creaking outside my cabin was getting louder, closer. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind or some animal moving through the underbrush. But deep down, I knew better. The quiet, oppressive atmosphere of the resort had already put me on edge, and now this unsettling noise was pushing me past my limits. I lay still, listening intently, the soft whisper of the wind the only sound I could hear besides the creaking. But then it stopped. For a moment, I thought I might be imagining things. I waited, straining to hear anything. The silence pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. And just when I thought it was over, I heard it again, the faintest scrape of something against the wood. It was coming from the front door. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the front desk? Should I check outside? My body was frozen, and a strange sense of dread had begun to settle in my stomach like lead. I slowly pulled the covers up to my chin, trying to make myself small, hoping whatever was outside wouldn't notice me. But then, I heard a voice. It wasn't loud, just a soft murmur, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. The words were indistinct, but I could make out one thing for sure: whoever was outside was speaking to me. I tried to breathe through the panic rising in my chest, telling myself that I had to stay calm. I needed to know what was happening, needed to find out if I was just being paranoid or if something truly strange was going on. I slid out of bed and tiptoed to the window, cautiously peeking through the thick curtains. The night outside was pitch black, but I could make out the faintest outline of a figure standing just beyond the reach of the porch light. It was a man, tall and thin, his back to me, facing the dark woods beyond the cabin. He wasn't moving, but something about him felt wrong. His posture was too stiff, too unnatural, as if he were standing there not out of choice, but because he had no other option. The murmur grew louder, clearer now, and I realized it was him speaking, repeating something over and over in a strange, sing-song tone that I couldn't make sense of. I could feel my pulse racing, my skin prickling with a cold sweat. I had to know what was going on. I grabbed the phone on the bedside table, dialing the front desk with shaking hands. "Hello?" A voice answered, soft and calm, almost too calm. "Hi, there's someone outside my cabin, I think." I paused, trying to steady my breathing. "There's someone standing out there. I don't know who they are." There was a long silence on the other end, and then the voice responded, just as calmly as before. "Don't worry about it. It's probably just one of the guests." "But I don't think it is," I said, my voice trembling. "This person, they're not moving. They're just standing there." "Everything's fine," the receptionist replied, though her voice was beginning to sound a bit too rehearsed, as if she had said this before. "Just lock the doors and you'll be safe." I didn't know if I felt reassured or more terrified. The calmness in her voice was almost too calm. I hung up the phone and stood there, frozen in the dark, staring out the window at the figure. But when I looked again, he was gone. I blinked. I could have sworn I had seen him just moments ago, standing there, but now the porch was empty, the darkness beyond my cabin silent. I slowly exhaled, trying to convince myself that my mind was playing tricks on me, that I had imagined the whole thing. But then, as I turned to walk back toward the bed, I froze. The door. It had been locked when I arrived. I knew for sure I had checked it, but now the lock was different. It wasn't fully engaged. It was as though someone had tampered with it. I reached for the door handle, hesitating for a moment, and then, slowly, I turned it. The door creaked open, and I stepped out onto the porch. I was immediately hit with the cold mountain air, the sharp scent of pine and earth filling my lungs. The night felt even darker now, the trees surrounding the cabin whispering with the wind. I hesitated, feeling a deep sense of unease creep up my spine. But I had to know. I had to see for myself if anything was out of the ordinary. I walked around the cabin, carefully scanning every corner of the property, my breath visible in the cold night air. But there was nothing. No figure, no movement. The resort seemed to be empty. The only sound, the faint rustling of the trees. But just as I was about to turn back to the cabin, I heard something, a voice, soft and distant, calling from the woods. It was unmistakable. "Help us." I spun around, my heart racing in my chest. There was no one there, but the voice seemed so clear, so real. The words were faint, like an echo, but I could swear I heard them. I stood there for a long time, the voice continuing, calling out to me. "Help us! Help us!" The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I knew then that I was no longer alone. Something, or someone, was out there in the woods, and it was not friendly. Without thinking, I rushed back inside the cabin, slamming the door behind me and locking it tight. I leaned against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to calm myself down. But the voice, that desperate plea, echoed in my mind. I couldn't shake it. I couldn't ignore the fear that had settled deep in my gut. I grabbed my phone and texted the front desk again, this time asking if anything unusual had happened at the resort recently. The response was quick, but the words made my stomach drop. "Please stay in your cabin. Everything will be fine. The woods have been unsettled recently." Unsettled. What did that mean? And why didn't they want me to leave my cabin? I knew something was terribly wrong. But what could I do? The roads up here were treacherous, and I didn't have a car. The resort was isolated, and I had no idea where I could go for help. The night dragged on in silence, the shadows outside growing darker, the air colder. And all the while, the voice kept calling, growing fainter, but still there, beckoning me toward the unknown. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a second. I kept the lights on, the curtains drawn tight, and I locked every door and window as if it could somehow keep whatever was lurking outside away. The voice, that chilling plea for help, echoed in my mind, pulling me into an abyss of dread. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just hearing things, that the isolation was getting to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the voice was real, that it was calling to me from somewhere deep in the woods. where no one else seemed to be. By the time morning came, I was a wreck. My eyes were bloodshot, my head throbbing from lack of sleep, but I couldn't just sit there anymore. I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening at this place. I decided to go to the front desk and ask for some kind of explanation. The receptionist, who had spoken to me the night before, greeted me with the same tight smile. She looked like she hadn't slept either, her eyes dark and tired, but she still exuded that eerie calm that made me uneasy. "Good morning," she said, her voice unnervingly soothing. "How are you today?" "Not great," I replied, trying to mask the panic in my voice. I heard something last night. I heard voice of someone calling from the woods. And when I checked outside, I saw someone standing on my porch. What's going on here? This place. It doesn't feel right." Her smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes shifted just. A brief flicker of something dark, something knowing. "I'm sorry you're feeling uneasy," she said, her voice growing softer, more rehearsed. "This place can be a little unsettling at times, but we assure you, you're safe." I didn't buy it. There was no way I was the only one hearing things, the only one feeling this way. I pressed on. "Why are there so few people around? I saw a treehouse last night, hidden away behind the cabins. I found journals and I told ones. They were talking about missing people, strange occurrences." The receptionist's eyes flickered again, and this time I saw something fear. A brief, fleeting look that disappeared so quickly, I almost thought I imagined it, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew. She was hiding something. "There's nothing to worry about," she said again, her voice colder now, but still maintaining that unsettling calm. "The guests are here for peace and quiet, just like you. The treehouse isn't for public use, so it's not something we usually bring up. It's part of the older history of the resort." But before she could finish, I interrupted. "The older history? What do you mean by that? Why aren't you telling me everything?" She paused, clearly uncomfortable, before leaning in slightly, lowering her voice so that only I could hear. "It's better if you don't know." Her words hung in the air, thick with tension, and I realized that I wasn't going to get any more out of her. She was hiding something, and whatever it was, I knew it had something to do with that voice I had heard, with the strange energy that seemed to hang over the resort. I left the front desk, my mind racing. The air around me felt heavier now, like I was walking through thick fog. My instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out of there as quickly as I could, but something kept me there: curiosity, fear, or maybe just the need to know the truth. I had to find out what was really going on. I decided to go back to the treehouse. Maybe I had missed something important. I had to know more about the people who had stayed here before me, about the history the receptionist had tried so hard to keep hidden. The climb up to the treehouse felt longer this time. The air was colder, and the forest around me seemed to close in tighter, the branches stretching toward me like skeletal fingers. When I reached the top, I took a deep breath and entered. The journals were still there, piled in the same corner, untouched. I flipped through them again, my hands trembling as I read the fragmented, disturbing entries. There were references to strange happenings, to a dark presence that had settled in the woods, and warnings to never stay after dark. But one entry in particular caught my attention. It was written in a hurried, frantic scrawl. "They told me to leave, but I can't. I've seen them. They don't look like people. They move too fast, like shadows. I hear their whispers, calling me, pulling me deeper into the woods. And there are others too, people who've gone before me. I saw them watching from the trees, their eyes empty and hollow, their mouths stretched in twisted grins. They won't let me leave. They'll take me. They'll take us all." I slammed the journal shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This was real. Something sinister was happening here, and I was caught in the middle of it. As I stepped down from the treehouse, my mind was reeling. The voice, the journals, the receptionist's strange behavior, it was all connected. But how? What was happening at this resort? And why had no one warned me? I knew I had to leave, but just as I turned to walk back to my cabin, I heard it again. The voice. This time, It was closer, much closer. It was no longer calling out from the woods, it was coming from the trees around me. Help us, help us. I spun around, my heart racing. The trees were moving, swaying unnaturally, and I could see them figure shapes, human-like but distorted, emerging from the shadows between the trunks. Their faces were pale, eyes dark and hollow, and they were staring at me with an intensity that sent a wave of panic crashing over me. I backed away slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. But the figures didn't move. They just stood there, watching. And then one of them took a step forward. "Come to us," it whispered, its voice barely audible, but I could feel it in my bones, vibrating deep in my chest. "You're not alone here." That was it, the last thing I needed. I turned and ran, as fast as I could, back toward the cabin, the sound of my breath mingling with the crunch of leaves underfoot. The figures didn't follow, but I knew they were waiting, watching. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me and sank to the floor, my body trembling. The air inside was suffocating. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The voices in the woods, the shadowy figures, the sinister past of the resort, everything was closing in on me. I had to leave. I couldn't stay another minute, but something told me that even if I ran, I wouldn't escape, not from whatever this place had become. The night felt longer than any I had ever experienced. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the wind, made my heart race. I couldn't bring myself to leave the safety of the cabin, though I knew it wouldn't do me any good. The figures I had seen were still out there, lurking in the trees, watching me, waiting for something. I couldn't just sit here in terror, waiting for whatever was coming next. I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to know why those figures had been watching me, why I could still hear their voices lingering in the air, calling to me. It felt like the walls of the cabin were closing in, and I couldn't breathe. I grabbed my phone, hoping to get some help, but there was no signal. Of course, it was as if this place had been designed to trap me, to isolate me from the world. My mind was racing, my thoughts jumbled. I had to leave, but the roads were treacherous, and the darkness outside was as thick as a cloak. What if I was being watched right now? Then I remembered something. The receptionist had mentioned before that the woods had been unsettled. What did that mean? Had she known more than she was letting on? I couldn't shake the feeling that she had been trying to protect me from the truth, but her words didn't line up. She seemed as much a part of this as everything else. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to confront her. I had to find out everything she knew about the history of this place. Maybe, just maybe, there was something that could explain what was happening to me, to everyone who had ever stayed here. I stood up, my legs trembling. Every instinct in me screamed to stay inside, to lock the doors and never open them again. But my curiosity was stronger. The need for answers was overwhelming. I stepped outside, the night air biting at my skin. It felt like the very forest itself was alive, breathing, watching me. The trees swayed, their branches creaking like the whispers of the figures in the woods. As I walked toward the main building, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me. The resort was eerily quiet. There were no other guests milling about, no sounds of laughter or conversation, just silence. As I approached the front desk, the receptionist's face appeared through the window. She was watching me, her eyes unblinking. I knocked on the door. She opened it slowly, her expression unreadable. "What can I help you with?" she asked, her tone smooth, almost detached. "I need to know more about this place, the history. What's going on here?" I demanded, my voice sharp. Her eyes flickered, and for a moment, I thought she might refuse to answer. But then she sighed, almost resigned. "I told you before," she said, her voice soft but firm. "This place has a history of unusual occurrences. It's been built on land that's older than anyone can remember. Some of the guests have had strange experiences, but it's nothing you need to worry about." "You're lying," I spat, my frustration bubbling over. "I've seen the figures in the woods. I've heard the voices. What are they? What's happening here?" She looked at me for a long moment, her gaze hardening. I could see a flicker of something behind her eyes, fear, maybe, but she quickly masked it with her practiced smile. You don't understand. You don't know what you're asking. You need to leave. Leave? My pulse quickened. I can't leave. Something's wrong with this place. You've been hiding something from me, haven't you? She hesitated, then slowly nodded. I didn't want to tell you. It's not something you can just walk away from. It's... Her voice trailed off as if she were searching for the right words. It's tied to the land. The people who built this resort, they didn't come here for peace. They were running from something. A curse. A darkness that follows them. A curse? I repeated, barely able to comprehend her words. What kind of curse? The curse of the lost souls, she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. They didn't know how to escape it, and neither will you if you stay here too long. Before I could ask her to explain further, the sound of a door creaking open interrupted us. From the corner of my eye, I saw the figure of a man stepping into the front office. He was tall, disheveled, his eyes wild and frantic. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, and he was staring at me, his gaze desperate. You shouldn't be talking to her, he said, his voice ragged. She's one of them. The receptionist's face went pale, and I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. She looked back at the man, her lips trembling. Leave now. This isn't your business. I've seen them, the man continued, his voice rising in desperation. They're not just in the woods. They're here in the resort waiting, watching, feeding on us. The curse. It doesn't let anyone leave. It doesn't matter who you are, how hard you try. It'll pull you in, like it pulled me. They're already here. They've been here all along. I froze. This wasn't just some isolated incident. Something far more sinister was at play. And whatever was lurking in the woods wasn't just watching from the shadow sit, was inside the very walls of the resort, waiting for the right moment to claim its next victim. The receptionist stepped back, her hand resting on a small bell on the desk. I could see the panic rising in her eyes as she realized that this man was getting dangerously close to revealing the truth. Please, you need to leave now. It's too late for you. But it was too late for all of us. The truth had already been revealed, and I realized that I couldn't leaven now. I had already been marked, already caught in the web of this cursed place. The man's eyes locked with mine, a fleeting moment of understanding passing between us. You're already one of them. You can't escape. I didn't know what he meant, but I knew he was right. Something had changed. I could feel it in my bones, in the air, in the very walls of the resort. The darkness was closing in on me, and there was no way out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the man was vanished into thin air, as if he had never existed at all. The receptionist slowly turned away, her eyes filled with dread. Go back to your cabin, she said softly. It's already begun. I couldn't process everything that had just happened. The man who'd appeared and then disappeared in front of me, the receptionist's cryptic warning, and the terrifying realization that I was no longer just a visitor at this cursed resort. I was part of it now. I had been marked. The receptionist's words echoed in my mind. It's already begun. What did she mean by that? What was beginning? The sense of impending doom hung heavily over me, as thick as the fog rolling in from the woods. My heart pounded, my pulse racing in my ears as I stumbled back to my cabin, every nerve in my body screaming to run to escape, but deep down, I knew it was too late for that. I reached the cabin, locking the door behind me and collapsing on the bed, the weight of the night pressing down on me. The room felt colder, the air heavier, and for a moment, I thought I might be hallucinating. But when I glanced around, I saw that everything was exactly as it should, but nothing had changed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then, the voices began. Soft at first, like whispers in the dark, so faint I thought they were just my imagination playing tricks on me. But they grew louder, more insistent. I could hear them now, calling from the forest outside my window. Help us. Come to us. I stood frozen, unable to move, as the voices grew stronger. They were no longer just in my mind, they were real. I could feel them tugging at my very soul, urging me to follow them, to step into the darkness where they waited. I wanted to scream, to run, to leave everything behind, but my body wouldn't respond. The whispers seemed to seep into my thoughts, pulling me toward the door. It's too late. Come home. I fought to stay in control, to push the voices out of my head. But I could feel the pull of the woods, the trees calling me like old friends, their branches beckoning, stretching toward me like fingers made of shadow. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, soft, hesitant, like a lover's touch. I staggered toward it, my mind clouded with fear, my body trembling as I reached for the handle. The moment I touched it, the door swung open of its own accord, and I was face to face with something I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't human. It was tall, unnaturally so, with skin like ash and eyes that glowed with a sickly green light. Its mouth was stretched in a grotesque grin, too wide for a human face, and its fingers were too long, like claws scraping against the wood as it leaned toward me. "Come with me," it whispered, its voice a rasping hiss that made my skin crawl. "It's time." Before I could even react, the thing reached out and grabbed my arm, its grip cold as death, its fingers digging into my flesh like talons. I tried to scream, to pull away, but its strength was overwhelming. It dragged me out of the cabin, and I could do nothing but follow. The forest loomed ahead, its trees swaying in the wind like sentinels, watching me with unseen eyes. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and every step I took felt like I was sinking deeper into the earth. The thing pulling me forward didn't speak again, but I could feel its presence, the weight of its gaze on the back of my neck, the chill in the air that seemed to grow colder the further we went. As we walked deeper into the woods, the ground beneath my feet turned soft and uneven. The trees around us closed in tighter, their branches twisting like gnarled hands, reaching for me, trying to grab hold. And then I saw it. The clearing. It was a vast, open space, but it wasn't peaceful. The ground was cracked and dry, the grass withered and dead. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, dark and weathered by time, and around it there were shapes, figures, human-like, but not quite. Their eyes were hollow, their skin gray and lifeless, and they stood in a perfect circle, as if waiting for something, waiting for me. I tried to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the heavy silence of the clearing. The thing that had grabbed me shoved me forward, and I stumbled, falling to my knees in front of the altar. And then, as if on cue, the figures began to move. They walked toward me slowly, their eyes fixed on me, their faces expressionless but somehow filled with hunger. One of them stepped forward, a woman if you could call her that. Her skin was stretched too tight over her bones, her eyes empty pits. Her voice, when she spoke, was a low rasp that scraped against my sanity. "You are one of us now," she said, her voice sounding like it was coming from 1,000 mouths at once. "The curse has claimed you." I tried to push away, to get up and run, but my body wouldn't respond. The air around me grew thick with a dark energy, like the very earth was pulsing with malevolent life. "You will stay," the woman continued, her hand reaching toward me. "You will never leave." I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I was paralyzed, trapped in the web of whatever dark force had taken hold of this place. The figures around me closed in, their hands reaching for me, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. I could feel the darkness pressing in from all sides, suffocating me, drawing me into its depths. I thought it was the end, that I was going to become like the moan of the lost souls that wandered this cursed land forever. But just as the darkness consumed me, I heard something. A voice, a familiar voice. "Get out of there. Now." It was the man from earlier, the one who had warned me. His voice cut through the fog of fear and confusion, sharp and urgent. I didn't know how, but somehow I found the strength to break free, to push past the figures that were closing in on me. I bolted to my feet and ran, my heart hammering in my chest as I sprinted through the woods. Behind me, I could hear the creatures, those things shoaling, their voices echoing in the night like a chorus of demons. The air around me grew colder, The trees seemed to close in tighter, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't think about anything but getting out, escaping this nightmare. Finally, I reached the edge of the woods and saw the resort in the distance, a faint glimmer of light through the trees. I ran toward it with every ounce of strength I had left, not daring to look back. When I reached the cabin, I slammed the door behind me and collapsed on the floor, gasping for air, my body shaking uncontrollably. I never saw the creatures again. I don't know if they followed me, if they're still out there, waiting for the next unsuspecting guest. But I know one thing for sure: the curse of that mountain resort is real. And once you step into the woods, you might never come back. The story reaches its terrifying climax, leaving the mystery unsolved and the question lingering: what truly awaits those who stay at the cursed mountain resort? This dark tale is a chilling reminder of the horrors that lie in the shadows, waiting to consume anyone who dares to uncover their secrets.